New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the role of Greek philosophy in the history of early Christianity. With me is Pierre Grimes, a philosopher, author of Philosophical Midwifery and a dialogue in heaven between Jesus and Socrates. Welcome, Pierre. And I want to mention that Pierre is also the founder of the Noetic Society. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's good to be with you once again, Pierre.
Pleasure indeed.
When we think of early Christianity, it's a simple fact that the early writings of the Christians were all in Greek.
True.
And I think it's a fact that's forgotten, but the significance of the early Christians all using the Greek language, because even though Israel was under Roman rule at that time, it was basically a Hellenic culture, wouldn't you say?
The fact that the Jewish scriptures were written in Greek makes the point that at that time Hebrew was already eclipsing as a popular language, because the Septuagint is written in Greek.
Well, it was, as I understand
in the second BC, yeah.
The Septuagint is a translation from the Hebrew.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it was considered necessary at the time because, to my understanding, the intellectual world in those days was all based on Hellenic culture, and particularly the Greek academies and Greek philosophy.
True. That's Hellenism ruled.
Mm-hmm. So we have, for example, the Gospel of John. Let's start there.
Oh. You see, one of the challenges is the fact that contemporary translations of the Bible are influenced by the theology of Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's the major takeoff point, because if you look at just the Gospel of John as a literary work, without interpreting levels of interpretation as they are removed from their original meaning, the actual Greek in the Gospel of John is filled with the idea of self, logos, divine illumination. And these are the principal ideas of Greek philosophy. Like, and the new translation, which a friend of mine is doing, he puts it, all things come to be according to the self. Without the self, nothing would come to be. Well, that totally changes contemporary view of the Gospel of John. It raises the idea of self and the logos, because in that translation, the logos is God.
Yeah.
But most people in our culture don't understand the Greek idea of the logos. Sometimes they translate it just with the word reason.
Well, the translation that I think I'm familiar with is word. In the beginning was the word.
But see, that diminishes it.
Yeah.
See, for Greek philosophy of the Platonic origin, the experience of divine illumination, the most brilliant light of being, is itself intelligible on the highest principles.
Yes.
Inherent within it, that intelligibility, that's the Logos. So therefore the Logos is God, because that divine luminosity is a manifestation of God. That's the way they call it. So that idea is Greek, and it plays a heavy role in Christianity if one wants to look at it directly. But we're so engulfed with these translations that do not represent the actual simple translation of the Greek. It becomes obscure and unknown.
Well, when we think of Greek culture, you were explaining to me earlier that the phrase, which I thought was attributed to Socrates, in fact, a recent guest on the program said as much, know thyself.
Right.
You point out that it is much more ancient even than Socrates or Pythagoras, to whom it is also credited that it was inscribed on the temple of Apollo.
Right.
Long before the origin of philosophy itself.
You see, that's so correct, because the role of the self in Greek culture is hidden. I called it the great betrayal. Because in Homer, the use of the word self occurs over 500 times, but it's not translated.
Yeah.
So therefore, for a Greek living at that time, or being Greek for the 1,000 years or more, let's say 1800 to 500, 1,200 years of the influence of Homer, they saw again and again reaffirms the idea of the self.
Well, let's talk about what that word means, because in English, there are many, many uses of the word self.
Right.
And you're using it in a very particular way.
Yes. You see, I'm really not a philosopher in one way. I'm a philosophical midwife. I spend a good part of my daily life working with people who have problems. Use the same method again and again. What we find in every case is a false belief about the self as the origin of all disasters and personal sufferings. What does that mean? That means, to me, that there must be something about the self that if you misunderstand it, it is at your peril. Because the consequences of it are going to be your suffering from misunderstanding the self. So, as I became involved in this again and again, and seeing the drama, personal drama repeat itself hundreds upon hundreds of times, the issue has to come up with, what is the power of the self? That you can't mislabel it without getting into dire consequences. So with that hunch, I have some very wonderful friends who are heavily involved in Greek, and I said, look, we're missing something. We're missing the role of the self. Well, luckily enough, in our Noetic Society, we have people who are well-versed in classical Greek. They took that challenge.
Yeah.
And now have done variety of translations where the self is used and they're judiciously putting it where it belongs.
And you find that it's used over and over again hundreds of times.
Hundreds of times.
In Homer and in Plato and
Proclus
and in the Gospels.
Now, I'll go back to your question, about the self. To put it simply, the idea of self replaces the idea of God. That's all. Because God is an object. He's a creator. He's a ruler. He does a variety of things that are qualified by his actions and the way he functions. isn't it interesting if the idea of self gains the status that we're talking about, then the highest concept is personal, at the same time being transcendental.
Yes.
So that, therefore, if you want to engage in the idea of the divine, you're really turning about and saying, how can I be better myself?
Mm-hmm.
That changes everything.
Well, and isn't that exactly why they inscribed that phrase in the Temple of Apollo, know thyself?
Yes, to have been one of them and to walk through that temple with this kind of knowing must have been quite an experience.
But now how does this differ from, let's say, the Vedanta philosophy in India, where Atman equals Brahman?
True. Even it's in Tibetan philosophy. It's in Korean Buddhism, the idea of self. It's in all what we call Abrahamic religions.
Non-Abrahamic.
Yeah, as understood by present translators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now you're saying it's in Christianity.
Yes, the only difference is the logos.
Mm-hmm.
When you combine the idea of the self with the logos, then that means you want to express its rational content. That means you have to have a way of approaching reason, and when you do that within the Greek world, that's an introduction into the need for the dialectic.
Mm-hmm.
That's a specific way of reasoning with these high ideals to end up coming to an understanding of the divine and the human condition.
Mm-hmm.
They're the only people that have that role of the logos. All of the other cultures, yes, they have a role for the self. But with the addition of the logos, it becomes intellectually one's own personal involvement, since every man who shares an intellect shares in the logos.
Mm-hmm. Now, early Christianity occurred, as I think we mentioned earlier, at a time under Roman rule,
right?
Not Hellenic rule,
right?
And Roman culture was distinctly different. I mean, it drew upon the Hellenic tradition, but as I understand it, the leading philosopher of the Romans at that time was Epicurus.
Sure.
And Epicurus was pretty much a materialist.
Yes.
He wasn't a pure mystic of the.
That's right.
He wasn't concerned about the self much. He was concerned about people having exquisite pleasures available to them in the material world as being sort of the epitome of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a time of great transition.
Yes. Every language has its strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
And the difficulty with the entire Roman or Latin world is that it lacked the word the. There is no equivalent to the idea of the in Latin.
No.
You cannot do Greek philosophy. You cannot use the mind intellectually without the use of the word the.
We use it so many times in English.
Yeah. Like when I gave a talk in St. Petersburg in Russia, and I introduced my speech by saying, gentlemen, I'm going to use a word which is not common in your language, the word the. And this is a very sensitive subject, because people who don't have the idea of the in their language look upon those cultures that do possess the idea of the as engaged in all kinds of abstract and perilous thinking.
Mm.
But it's limiting without, because you can't say the good, the idea of the good. You can't give a substantive quality to adjectives, because that's what the definite article does. It takes an adjective and makes it into a substantive. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that power in language, then you can't transform major adjectives into nouns or substantives. Mm. Without that, you can't play the game with the intellect.
Well, I do know that there are those who criticize our use of the in philosophy. Sure. I have talked to, for example, my friend Glenn Perry, who convened a conference of philosophers. Well, it was actually a conference of quantum physicists and Native American elders comparing ideas in quantum physics with Native American language, and they hardly have any nouns at all. Everything's a verb.
Everything's a verb.
Yeah.
Process. See, that's a language full of action.
Yeah.
Yes.
But Greek philosophy is different.
Yes, it heavily with verbs, and it also transforms a verb into a noun, too. Like one of the key ideas in Greek that isn't often translated into English is the word ousia, O-U-S-I-A. And that's the power the mind has to turn around and reflect upon itself. That's a verb. That's an action. But they can then talk about the ousia. They're making it into a noun. So this ability of the to transform adjectives does the same thing with verbs.
Yeah. The mind reflecting on itself.
Yeah.
Reflection.
Right. Right.
Which is sort of the essence of mental processes, reflection.
Yeah, it's just the reason why metaphysically it's so important that the experience of divine illumination is itself a dynamic. It's alive, it's vital, has a vital, but it has the power of reflecting upon itself. It turns upon itself in a remarkable and indescribable way. So that's inherent, that ousia is inherent in the highest vision of reality, which we share in our own lower level of reflection upon ourselves and about other things. But what happens... See, it all started with Parmenides' teacher, Xenophanes. Xenophanes said, it's the whole that sees and hears and thinks. What does he mean by whole? Well, many people that we now have fragments of what they thought because we don't have the whole of their writings, but their thought was captured by later thinkers so we can pull it out and say it. Many of them said, what he means by whole is the mind. Right, then it's the mind that sees and hears and thinks. Some came along and said, excuse me, self. What does that do to it?
It enlarges it. One assumes that the self is more than just the mind.
Right. That's the big step.
Yeah.
From mind to self is a jump in Greek thought. And that characterizes what they call Platonists. That is current. See, one of the most remarkable discoveries is the Nag Hammadi library.
Yes.
Because now we have, many, many different Gospels.
Early Christian texts.
Very early Christian Gospels.
Preserved.
Yeah. And then if you read the Gospel of James or the book of James, you're suddenly confronted with Greek philosophy in its entirety. The need to know thyself. The need to experience a brilliant light of being. The idea of the Logos, it's all there. But you know what's missing? Resurrection, forgiveness of sins, all of the Pauline doctrines are not there.
In the original Gospels as found in the Nag Hammadi library.
Right.
And as I recall, what you explained to me is that all of those Gospels end at an earlier point than the interpretations that are common today.
Well, see, the issue of dating is still going on because so much is at stake. Because, Paul dies at 57 A.D., right? The first gospel, Mark, there's arguments about minus and plus in all of these judgments because there's arguments about it. But what I think is the latest view is 78. Some people are pushing it to 80 A.D.
The latest date of the
origin of those
all
the Gospel
four
of Mark.
Gospels.
No.
Just
Mark. Mark is the first.
Mark.
Yeah.
Origin of Mark, somewhere around 78, 80
right.
A.D.
Right. And John is close to 100, 90 something, depending upon who you read.
Yeah. And the writings of Paul are all earlier.
Yes, he died at 57, so he did his work, what they're called the 7 letters, during his conversion trips, as he made 3 of them throughout the Near East.
Yeah. So it's natural then that the Gospels that came later would be interpreted in the light of the writings of Paul.
Yes, you see, Christianity is not really Christianity. So, wait a minute. What does that mean? What does that mean? So,
we got to unpack that.
Okay, look here. The central doctrine of present-day Christianity is not Gospels. It's Paul. What makes Paul distinctive? The justification of faith. It's because of Jesus died for your sins, that therefore your sins can be abolished, and upon your death, if you have faith, you gain heaven. There's only one difficulty with that. You can't find that. Literally, you cannot find that in the Gospels. In my early years, I had a great interest in Catholicism. I was raised as a Catholic altar boy. When I came into Greek thought, after World War II, I got into college and did some Greek. It disturbed me to discover the differences between the Gospel and Paul. Yep. So I went around to different Catholic priests and I said, "Look, gentlemen, I have a question. I don't want to stir up controversy in any way. I just have a simple question. I can't find what's principally said in the letters of Paul in the Gospel of Mark, and he's the first Gospel." Well, wherever I went, I got pretty much the same answer, which is, Pierre, you can't design a religion out of the Gospels. That's why we go to Paul.
Yeah.
Well, then Christianity should be called Pauline. Paulinism.
Paulinism, which is probably an accurate interpretation.
Yes. See, the question about Mark is so intriguing, is that all of the earliest Gospels that we have recovered, all came into existence around 350, 375 AD. There are basically 5 of them.
After the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah. And in every case, the Gospel of Mark ends at verse 6, chapter 16, 8.
In the earliest, you're talking about in the Nag Hammadi.
Yeah. No. All of the Gospel of Mark ends at 16:8, according to 5 of the most ancient texts.
Okay.
Therefore, where did the additional 12 come from? Because today's versions go to 16:20. Those are the claims for resurrection. Those are the claims that support a Pauline doctrine that were added. They must have been added by the church some years after 375 or close to 400 AD. So when I found this, which, by the way, is quite obvious to everyone who studies this, it's not an esoteric teaching.
Well, let me ask you this question.
Sure.
Since the Pauline doctrine is so important in Christianity, to what extent do you think Paul himself was influenced by the Hellenic philosophical tradition?
He cut it out. That was his goal.
In other words, it had a big influence on him in a negative way.
Yes. You cannot find, if you can't find Paul and John, where can you find it? Well,
because the idea of the resurrection, the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection is really crucial.
Right.
And you do find examples of gods who die and are reborn.
Yes.
And you find that in Samaria, you find that in Egypt.
True. central.
Yeah. I don't know that you find it in the Greek religions.
No, you have reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
See, for Plato and the Neoplatonists or Platonists, your life is here to learn. You're here to know the self. You're here to struggle to discover the self. Okay. You take whatever you've learned into the next world, and that determines your experience in the next world and your next reincarnation.
Mm-hmm.
And Plato outlines that in the Phaedo, the end, the myth of Er,
yes.
and the Republic. And
Er is a soldier that Plato writes about who dies in battle and is about to be burned on a big funeral pyre. When he wakes up, he's had like a near-death experience.
Right.
And that becomes central to Platonic philosophy.
That's right. That's right. And the source of that, see, in Greek, they're Armenians. That's an Armenian. The name is
Er.
Yeah, and he comes from, the name is given Paphylian. Yeah. That means Armenians. The Armenians play a very curious role in the history of Christianity. They were translating Proclus in the 12th century.
Oh. Proclus being the last of the Neoplatonic philosophers.
Yeah, and perhaps one of the greatest, Proclus in Damascus.
Uh-huh.
And if you want, Pseudo-Dionysius. But the staggering fact that they were able to keep alive that tradition for 1,200 years or more
in Armenia.
Yeah, and then to translate it in the 12th century, what kind of a culture must they have had? And we don't know that.
No, it sounds like what we'd call a high culture.
Yeah, very high culture. Mm-hmm. See, the Greek culture, which is why there's a great difference between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, that the Greek Church did not include the revelations of John. No Armageddon.
Oh, that John.
Yeah.
It's a different John.
See, that's an argument, whether it's the same John or not.
Yeah.
But it looks like, since he came from the island of Patmos, there's a whole discussion about the date.
Mm-hmm.
And since they dated at about 120 AD, it's a little difficult to believe that that's the same John that wrote the other. And whether or not John could have been one of the disciples, that's another kind of crazy question.
Mm-hmm. But, well, it's a very common name today, and it was probably common in the ancient world as well.
Oh, yeah. So the Greek church, as different from the Roman, they saw the development of Christianity as part of their own Greek culture.
Yeah.
And therefore, they kept alive their own culture to interpret the Gospels.
Mm-hmm.
Rome wants to take the Gospels and the doctrines of Christianity interpreted vis-a-vis Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
The real question is, how are you going to look upon the role of Judaism in terms of the development of Christianity? Is it different? Is it Greek? Or is it Israeli? Is it Hebrew? Which one? That's the battle.
Well, but this was a melting pot in the Middle East. I mean, Alexander brought Hellenic culture to the Middle East.
Oh, in a magnificent way, yeah.
But he also, his armies went all the way to India.
All the way, and to Egypt.
And so what you have at this point in time is a fusion of culture ranging from the Persians, the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Indians, the Jews, and to some extent the Africans as well. They were all mingling and trading with each other.
That's right.
We call it the ancient world, but it's humanity, civilization had been around for thousands of years prior to that time.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah. We're hooked into literary traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Therefore, if you have literary remains, we can understand you. Or we allow ourselves to understand you on the basis of their literature.
Yeah.
Not any other form.
But I'm under the impression at that time in the ancient world, in addition to Christianity, there were thousands of religions bubbling around. It was very, because there was largely a pagan society with many different gods and the acceptance of many different gods and many types of efforts for fusion or syncretism of the different traditions.
See, what's quite interesting about the Greek gods is that for we, European Americans, if we want to understand Greek mythology, we're stuck. We have a problem. Because you need to try to understand how the Greeks understood their own gods.
Right.
So who will give us that insight into the way the Greeks understood their gods? Well, Plato uses them, right? Plotinus refers to them every once in a while, right? And etc. Who's the one spokesman who can talk about?
Well, of course, Homer wrote a lot about the gods.
Right.
Yeah.
So it becomes a rather interesting issue. There's one book by Proclus. Now, he lived at 470 AD, see, and was the head of the Plato's Academy. And he did a work called The Theology of Plato.
Yes.
Now, if someone wants to understand Plato, he's the spokesman that brings together 1,000 years of development of Platonic thought. And he lays it out in this way. If you want to understand the Greek gods, it's important to recognize that each god represents a principle. What did you say? I said each god represents a principle. That principle, therefore, can be unpacked, since it then becomes a metaphor, and it can then take on a form. It can then be personified by one of the names of these gods.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when you got the 12 gods, you really have 12 principles in a hierarchy.
It sounds very similar to the Hebrew Kabbalah, the tree of life, the idea of the emanations from the single divine source.
That's true, except, according to the good authorities, the Kabbalah only came into existence by the 12th century in Islamic Spain. And there are many writers who want to attribute the Kabbalah to ancient Jewish tradition.
Right.
But in terms of some great historical authorities, they know it came out of Spain, they know the town it came out of, and they know that there were Neoplatonists among the Jews in Islamic Spain. And that's its origin. And comparably wise, there's a way of reading the same Kabbalah in terms of Greek mythology. So,
well, and another way to look at it as well, if we're talking about the Greek pantheon, the Greek pantheon is very, very similar to the pantheon of the Vedic culture in India.
That's true, because there's a link between all non-Abrahamic religions. See, these religions become a body of thought. What they call pagans, they have a relationship among themselves. That's worth studying. That's what I study, or have, or do.
But when we talk about any religion, it would seem to me that you've got different levels. You have the folk religion, where the common masses will go to the temple and they pray for good luck and for a good crop and so on, and they worship the deities and beseech the deities for favor. But Proclus was a philosopher. Plato was a philosopher. So the very idea that the deities are principles is a philosophical notion, not particularly one that would be practiced by the folk traditions.
Well, that's certainly true. This is a if you want to call it is a question whether even you want to call these other things religions.
Yeah.
You see, because the word means to bind together. Religio means to bind together, that which binds together.
Oh, very similar to the origin of the word yoga.
Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, quite true. Binds together yokes. Yes, quite true. And that group that binds itself together with a common belief coming out of Abraham is the mark that ties all of the Christianity, Judaism, and Islam together.
Right.
Right. But the commonness, like I study Tibetan philosophy, Chinese philosophy, etc., and that they have a unity. You can find a unity among them, and their variations are intriguing.
Yeah.
But the difference with the Greek is the logos. That there is a principle of understanding that they unfold that allows you to bring yourself and your view of yourself and your thinking about the universe and man's place in it in a coherent form that's intelligible to all, which is itself a prayer. Look, it is itself a way of praying.
Explain that.
So, is the idea of prayer different in the Abrahamic religions and the way non-Abrahamic religions pray?
Well, did philosophers pray?
Yes.
Okay.
Plato did. Pardon me, Socrates did. And he has a prayer. There's a beautiful one at the end of the Phaedrus where he says, he said, "Let it be that I am only as rich as only as rich and have only as much gold as a poor man needs to survive." Pardon me, is that a prayer?
Well, it could be, sure.
But it isn't. It's a rather curious kind of prayer, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But he's saying, oh God, let me live true to my own integrity.
Right. That's different than often the way in which prayers are discussed and prayed in today's world.
It has more of a philosophical quality to it.
Right. Absolutely right. Yeah. And like the fundamental difference, really, is another way of looking at this, is that the role of sacrifice is essential to understand in the Abrahamic group, or Abraham. That sacrifice, Abraham so feared God that he was willing to sacrifice his son on an altar that he built on top of this little mountain, right?
Yes, that's central to all the Abrahamic traditions, and people usually identify it with the notion of obedience.
Yes, but the Greek is not. It's Prometheus.
Who challenged the gods.
And it brought to man the gift for his survival. Now, like, we really need the myth of Prometheus. For what reason, see? Because Prometheus then gave man the tools that allowed him to be free of labor. What does that mean? Have we reached the point in our culture where there should be a guaranteed annual income to free man from labor?
Not quite.
No, but that would be following the Prometheus legend.
Yes, well, I'm sure it's discussed because there is the suggestion that at some point in the future we'll have robots to do all the labor.
And therefore it's going to happen.
We're going to have to find ways of dealing with all our leisure time.
That's right. And of course, philosophers don't have any problem with that. We just do what we do, and as we always have and always will. It
will go on for all eternity.
Yes.
I think even after the sun dies out, if there's a heaven, there will be beings in heaven discussing philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of the self.
That's right. That's right.
Because I consider the philosophy of the self, that you're talking about the self identifying with the source of all creation.
Yes.
That it's at some level, deep within our own awareness, we're connected to the birth and death of the entire universe.
Yes.
Now, a lot of philosophers would not consider that philosophy. They'd say that's mysticism.
Yeah, well, I don't have a choice. I think Mortimer Adler coined it and expressed it to me in a very beautiful and simple way.
Mm-hmm.
When he created the 100 Great Books,
yes,
he added a volume of his own called The Great Conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, he says, the reason we don't include different traditions or different cultures in the 100 Great Books selection is because all of these people are involved in an ongoing dialogue among themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason he is not going to introduce in his 100 Great Books anything other than that kind of ongoing dialogue.
In other words, the Western intellectual tradition.
Right.
He's basically saying, yes, there is a Chinese tradition, a Japanese tradition, but it's not part of our conversation.
That's right. Mm-hmm. That's the principle. And see, actually, Europe really, I think, emerges from Bacon, when Bacon said, you have to have a new idea of knowledge. Knowledge is power. And the way to get that power is you have to subject nature to torture. You have to torture her to make her discover and to reveal her secrets.
Yes, a very unfortunate turn of phrase.
But that's what the word experiment means.
Uh-huh. Is that right?
Well, what do we do when we experiment with animals? We torture them.
Yeah.
To make them reveal
But is that
secrets.
part of the etymology of the word experiment?
If it isn't, it should be.
Well, to come back to our topic a little more directly, I think we need to discuss the figure of Jesus when you talk about early Christianity. After all, even though it's largely a Pauline doctrine, even Paul makes Jesus somehow central.
Actually, he makes himself more central. I once made a study of Paul, and I think it's fun to do. Take the beginning statement of every one of Paul's letters, and he's really proclaiming himself as a disciple of God, not Jesus. He never quotes any of the Gospels.
Well, they weren't written.
No, but if the Gospels represent in any way what Jesus said and did.
And I know this, scholars do believe that at one time there was a book that people had collected the actual sayings of Jesus, and that the writers of the Gospel had access to that book and drew upon it.
Yes, that's called Q. Mm-hmm. The common material that can be found in the Gospels apart from John.
Yeah.
Right? It's called Q, and it's dated about 50 A.D.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By the way, wouldn't it be interesting to know that Paul does not quote one of those sayings in what is called Q at all?
I see. Very interesting. Yes, that is interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
See, the Roman Church has directed all of their thought to correspond what they see as the implications of the Pauline doctrine. I think it's time for a new, fresh look at Christian doctrines, and if we mean by that all of the Nag Hammadi Gospels and reports, a new, beautiful new translation of what should be the New Testament Gospels, and sit down together and form what would be a coherent and meaningful doctrine that's central to Christianity and reflects the essence of their texts. Mm-hmm. That's what they need.
Well, isn't that...
like they're having a problem with their church, with their priests.
You're saying they're having much deeper problems.
This is much deeper.
The problem with the priests may be a result of errors that were made in theology 2,000 years ago.
That's right.
Well, you wrote a book called Jesus and Socrates, A Dialogue Made in Heaven.
Yes, that's true.
And in that book, as I understand it, what you're really claiming is that there's an enormous kinship between Jesus and Socrates.
That's right. Yeah, but that's because they're dialoguing in heaven, and therefore they can reveal what they think to one another.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was overheard, and it was passed on to me. You see, when I write, I recognize that I haven't developed a good memory.
Mm.
Like the Greeks loved to develop memory. That was one of their great virtues.
The art of memory.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's what Homer was largely passed down an oral tradition by memory.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for at least 400 years. Mm-hmm. Yes. So when I write, it's so that later I can reflect on it.
Mm-hmm.
So these are my reflections.
Okay.
You see.
Mm-hmm.
So I did this work, which may be published, called Return of the Gods. But it's like 700 pages.
Mm-hmm.
And I started it 40 years ago. And they're my notes, my philosophical notes. I just put them in. And about 4 or 5 years ago, someone said, well, why don't you bring them all together? And I said, oh my gosh, what a task, because I didn't organize it to be published, but they're my reflections. I put them together. Mm-hmm. By the way, with help from others, because it turned out there were maybe 30 versions of it. I used to wake up at about 2 a.m. and do a couple of hours of work, then go back to bed. And that was my style. And so the Return of the Gods is a view of Hermes and Hephaestus are sitting together in heaven looking down at earth, and they're saying, we got a mission from Zeus to see whether mankind should survive or not, because what he's doing is going to destroy everything. So we're sent down here to see whether we should wipe out the race of man to save the earth. And that's the Return of the Gods. So they make an analysis of what's going on. And their final report is, of course, is to see whether or not mankind can survive or should survive on the highest principles. But I wrote it because I like reflecting, and I use my own writings to reflect upon. Like this morning, I was enjoying going over that Socrates and Jesus. Yes. It's my way of generating and continuing my own reflections. So I tend to be my own student.
Well, would you say that Jesus falls inside the tradition of Greek philosophy?
Well, that's the battle.
Yeah.
See, that's the battle of Socrates and Jesus. Is it possible that, what the whole structure of the book is to discover, Socrates turns to Jesus and he says, neither of us wrote what we thought while we were alive, that. And we've left it to interpreters to understand what we didn't write, but said. Say, how good are your interpreters? And Jesus said to Socrates, how about yours? And so the dialogue reveals different, you can call them different problems in understanding these two thinkers, Jesus and Socrates. So it's really a critique, which I hadn't intended when I wrote it, of a way of identifying hierarchically weak, what I would really call an analysis of interpretations and to put them in a hierarchy and the principles behind each one of the interpretations that then correspond to the thinkers who took their stand in interpreting both Jesus and Socrates.
Sure, you have these enormous traditions, supposedly each based on these figures, and yet, as you point out, we don't know for sure what they really thought.
That's right. That's right. That's the mystery. So that's what the book presents. And so I have the chronicle and the list of the dangers of interpretation. And the goal of the dialogue, of course, in the end, is to see whether or not they can both shake one another's hands and say we agree with one another.
Yeah.
But how it ends, I'll leave to the reader.
Well, as I understand, and I'm not a Christian, I've never been a Christian, I have a great interest in Christianity, naturally, but didn't Jesus suggest something like if you listen to what I'm saying, if you follow these teachings, you should be able to do healings and miracles as I do, and even greater things than this. Yeah. And that the idea that when Jesus expresses his own identification with the Father, that he's suggesting that same identification is available to those who follow his teachings.
Yeah.
That would be an example, I think, of what I would call pure mysticism.
Yeah, it is. It is pure mysticism.
And now, do you find, how does Socrates express that idea?
Well,
or Plato?
Yeah, well, so yes, you're quite right by making that reference. You see, are we dealing with Plato? Are we dealing with Plato's understanding of Socrates, and how good is how good is Plato's understanding of Socrates is one of the issues in the dialogue. And by the way, Plato gets a low grade.
Just as Paul does.
Yes. And they're contrasted. And why they're contrasted and given such a low grade is the subject of the work. Yes. And actually, it's really fun to read it. I was reading it this morning, chuckling about it. But see, it comes down to, what are the essentials of Greek philosophy? And it comes down to, when you line them up, to what extent is what we call philosophical midwifery present among the Greeks? Second, how important is the role of dreams in understanding dreams? And is there a rational method for following some outline of questions which will invariably lead to an insight into dreams? Right? And I go a step further and say you can do the same thing with daydreams. So when you look at each of these interpreters of Socrates or Jesus, especially Socrates, if he was alive to those things, well then, by the way, Plato doesn't have any place for dreams. He doesn't explain them. He cites Socrates' expression how important they are, but he doesn't provide us with a way to understand it. So that's a weakness in Plato. Yeah.
Well, we'll have a whole other conversation about philosophical midwifery.
All right.
And but I think for now it's fair to say we've covered a lot of ground.
Again.
Pierre Grimes, it's been a joy to be with you.
I enjoy talking to you, indeed.
Thank you so much.
Rare thinker that we can have fun together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
For being with us.
Yes, indeed.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy.